أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. لا أقسم بهذا البلد وأنت حل بهذا البلد ووالد وما ولد لقد خلقنا الإنسان في كبد أيحسب أن لن يقدر عليه أحد يقول أهلكت مالا لبدا أيحسب أن لم يره أحد ألم نجعل له عينين ولسانا وشفتين وهديناه النجدين فلاقتحم العقبة وما أدراك ما العقبة فك رقبة أو إطعام في يوم ذي مسغبة يتيما ذا مقربة أو مسكينا ذا متربة. Sadaqallah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I do swear by this city of Mecca, even though you, O Prophet, are subject to abuse in this city, and by every parent and their child. Indeed, we have created humankind in constant struggle. Do they think that no one has power over them, boasting, I have wasted enormous wealth? Do they think that no one sees them? Have we not given them two eyes and a tongue and two lips and show them the two ways of right and wrong? If only they had attempted the challenging path of goodness instead. And what will make you realize what attempting the challenging path is? It is to free a slave or to give food in times of famine to an orphaned relative or to a poor person in distress. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another edition of Islam for Europeans. I'm your host, Robert. Please like and subscribe to our channel. And I wanted to make a response video to a response that someone made to a recent poll. The gentleman goes by the name Weapon of Kings. The handle is Imperious underscore 13. And I originally made a poll about, pro-Tate Muslims and would they have the same unquestioning allegiance to him if the women in question were from their cultural background. I do kind of regret making this poll and wording it the way I did. I want to address that in a little bit. But basically, the gentleman, Weapon of Kings, is saying that I presume the manosphere is typically dealing with what Islam would consider a whore and a slave. If these women belong to a husband, then it's a different question. But it's basically all bets off otherwise, as it should be. So, and something that Muslims, they have to realize is that, up until recently, Muslims have always been dealing with anti-Islam allegations from the anti-Islam right, whether that's from your modernists like Jordan Peterson, or ex-Muslims like Apostate Prophet, or just people whose profession it is to give a negative impression of Islam, like your Sam Harris and whatnot. But when it comes to the dissident right, they usually have a lot more respect for Islam, even if it's things that are not necessarily Islamically true, or perhaps there's far more nuance to the subject, which hopefully I can give today. They will even try to find the positives in that, right? So whereas the anti-Islam right would say, Islam is evil and so on and so forth, they might say things like based, or this is, we can implement this in our society, just because it takes everything, so because they're looking at things from the most extreme viewpoint. So hopefully, this is a sensitive topic, so hopefully I can give more nuance to the subject. But hopefully this is a good, a good primer for what Muslims actually believe about things like slavery and and being married to a slave. So just to give a backdrop, one of the important things we need to keep in mind that when we're looking at how Muslim scholars look at things in the contemporary world today, right? Whenever Muslims make fatwa or fatwas about how Muslims should behave in a certain context, they always take into place the time, the place, and the situation in which Muslims are living, and that may differ from how Muslims did certain things during the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the first three generations of Muslims. That's not a contradiction. It's just that there's so, life is full of, intricacies and changing landscapes and whatnot. And, we have, when we take a look at how Muslims should act in certain contexts, the scholars always take a holistic approach. So they look at the entirety of the Quran, look at the entirety of the Hadith, and how Muslims behave in a certain way, and from that they make rulings on how Muslims should behave in the present day, right? So let's go back to the Prophet's time, 7th century CE Arabia. It was a very violent time. It was a very, different tribes, going against each other. And, in the context of battle, when let's say there was a battle or skirmish going on between, two groups of non-Muslims, right? There would be fighting on both sides. Some of the men would be killed or injured. And then on top of that, you're going to end up having prisoners of war. Either from soldiers who surrendered or from people from the town or the city. Normally, in pre-Islamic Arabia, these slaves would pretty much be killed, or they would be totally enslaved with no chance of their freedom, right? So, in the 7th century Arabia, when Islam came, first of all, for the first several years, when the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was delivering his message to worship the one God, the Muslims were not allowed to fight back at all. He was preaching peacefully in Mecca. They were being oppressed by the pagans in Mecca, right? And eventually, it got so bad that the Muslims who were there had to migrate from Mecca to Medina. This is called the Hijra, and this is why it's called the Hijri calendar. That's when the Islamic calendar started, right? So it was only after several years when the verses of the Quran came down that Muslims would be allowed to defend themselves, and all of the battles that took place between the Muslims and the pagans in Mecca or other tribes were all defensive wars, right up until the death of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So that's one thing to keep in mind. So Islam had very strict rules on engaging in combat. Like for example, when Muslims were engaging in combat, you couldn't cut down a tree, you couldn't attack non-combatants, you couldn't attack women, you couldn't attack children, you couldn't attack the clergy of the people who were fighting. You could only fight against combatants, right? And in addition, it also had several rules regarding slavery, right? Because as I said before, when there's a battle between two groups, you have all these prisoners of war. If you let them go, right, obviously at that time, it's going to be chaos. I mean, they're going to come back and attack you, or they're going to spill all the secrets to people who are fighting you, and no tribe would survive that way if you couldn't take prisoners of war. But Islam instituted several rules and regulations for dealing with prisoners of war. There was opportunities for ransom, to ransom. If people were ready to pay the ransom, they could be released as in terms of a ransom. And there were certain instances in which prisoners of war were set free. And also in terms of taking care of slaves, because this was the only way that slavery could happen at this time. When the Muslims were in Mecca and Medina, was if there was a battle situation, then you end up having prisoners of war. But the Quran, instituted and made believers. How do I say this? Obligated believers to be kind to slaves, to give them to feed them as you would feed yourselves, so food, water, clothing, and shelter. Right. So, and then on top of that, if slaves wanted to work towards their freedom, they could write down a contract and work towards their freedom as well. So that was another way in which slaves could be granted their slavery, also granted their freedom. Also, the Quran considers freeing a slave or manumitting a slave a highly meritorious act, right? So the reward for freeing a slave is extremely high. It's basically a way of salvation from the fire. Also, freeing a slave is also an expiation for certain sins. For example, breaking your oath or missing a day during Ramadan. So Islam always encouraged the freeing of slaves, right? So that's another important thing to keep in mind. Right. So now we come to the sensitive topic of marrying your slave or having relations with your slave. So again, this is during the 7th century in that particular context, right? Because, like I said, when you have prisoners, when you have a situation where there's a battle going on, many of the men are going to be killed, and you're going to be left these prisoners of war, and some of them are going to be widows. Still, if a Muslim had a slave, a female slave, and they wanted to have relations with them, they had to treat them as they treated their wives. They had to feed them and clothe them and give them support, and also feed and clothe and give support to the children of those slaves as well. And when a slave woman gave birth to her master's child, right? Then she was actually a raised in status. So she was no longer called a slave, was called Walad, which means mother of the child. So this is a higher status. And then once the master dies, that woman is no longer a slave. She becomes a free woman, and her child, which her child is born a free boy or girl as well. And this is a way for people to earn their freedom, right? So, and again, it sounds barbaric. During the 7th century, we're talking, if you're thinking it from like a modernist or postmodernist perspective, because you're talking about a totally different world back then. You're talking about a world where people you didn't have checks, you didn't have a way to pay people wages, right? So I mean, slavery was an institution that was worldwide. The Chinese owned slaves, the Europeans owned slaves, the Indians owned slaves, Africans owned slaves. This was the way it was back then, right? But still, Islam was the very first and at the time the only doctrine that had all of these checks and balances for freeing people who were slaves, for taking care of slaves, for taking care of the kids that came from those slaves. And on top of that, this is, I'm getting into the whole thing about the Tate thing, is that, a slave woman and her who's having sexual relations with their master, that, the Muslim who's the owner, who's a slave owner, cannot sell off or, whore this woman out. That is completely forbidden in Islam, even in this particular situation, right? So, he can't become a pimp where, he just sells off this woman for a night and, takes any of the funds. That's completely disallowed in Islam. You cannot be a pimp in Islam. It's completely forbidden. The punishment for that is very severe. So in that particular pre-modern context, even that, you had to treat them right. You had to feed them, clothe them, give them food and water, just as you did with your wives. And at the same time, this person is not a sex slave that you can make money off of. Okay. So again, that's in the 7th century context, right? But now we're getting the 21st century. There's a couple of things to keep in mind. One is that there's no such thing as Dar Harb, which is the abode of war, and Dar Islam, which is the abode of Islam, or the Dar Kufr, which is the abode of the disbelievers. These concepts were never enumerated in the Quran or the Sunnah, right? These whole terms were created by the scholars of early Islam to better understand the world around them. Because at that time, you had Muslims living in one area and non-Muslims living in another area. And at that time, Muslims honestly, would not be able to live in those regions, because they wouldn't be allowed to practice their religion. It was a much tougher time back in the pre-modern era. But those terms don't apply today. You can't call Romania Darul Harb. You can't call Romania Darul Kufr. The Muslim nations of the world, they signed contracts as nations with non-Muslim countries. So, and a Muslim always holds to their contracts. You can't go back against what you've written down in a contract. There's one situation where one of the early Muslims, he was, taken captive by the pagan Arabs in Mecca, right? And as part of the treaty that the Muslims signed with the pagans, one of the stipulations of that treaty is that this person who was freed could not come back and fight against fight against the pagans at that time. And even though that was totally, even though the fighting between the Muslims and the pagans at that time was, a dire situation, still that Muslim man that was freed was not allowed to fight. So, what about situations in which you have, countries sign contracts with other countries? You have to still have to hold to those rules, right? That's one of the very important things in Islam, is that a believing Muslim is someone who always holds true to their contracts and their covenants, right? So at the country level, a Muslim country can't declare a non-Muslim country dar al-harb, because they're allowed to practice their religion in that country. So by default, you can't treat non-Muslim women, like they're slaves that need to be bagged. First of all, it's not even a war situation, right? Only a Muslim state can declare another country dar al-harb, or abode of the disbelievers, and no Muslim country has done that. So to try to justify, like sleeping with non-Muslim women, or turning them into webcam girls, or making them become your slaves, totally unjustifiable in Islam. One, because it's not a war situation. Two, because you as an individual can't declare war on a non-Muslim country. So that's a no-go either. So yeah, that's not a lawful relationship whatsoever. And a Muslim, you can't even touch people of the opposite gender unless they're your wife, or like a close relative. So what about what's we're talking about things that are way worse, which is giving them alcohol and grooming them or sleeping with them, completely unacceptable in Islam. And again, slavery, it's an institution that for the most part has died out in the world. And all Islamic scholars are in agreement that even though slavery existed back in the day, there's no need to bring this institution back. Islam was always on the side of slavery. It's a necessary thing. It's a necessary evil, and we should work towards emancipation in any way, shape, or form, because there's such a high status for freeing slaves, right? So yeah, so when we go back to the whole thing about Andrew Tate, and again, Brother Andrew is another story altogether. I mean, a lot of these things that he said, on videotape or tweets that he made were before he converted to Islam. And in Islam, we believe that when you convert to Islam, all of your previous sins are forgiven. However, that doesn't mean that, if you stole from somebody, or if you took the rights from somebody, whether they're Muslim or not, they don't have to pay them back. You have to pay them back. This is an obligation of every Muslim, that they're not in, that they pay off debts when they're supposed to, that they don't do any wrongdoing, whether it's Muslims or non-Muslims. So, he's currently under trial now. We'll see how it pans out. But, there's no way you can, from an Islamic perspective, no way you can justify, telling women that you want to marry them, bringing them to your, lodge or whatever, turning them into sex slaves, and then putting them on a webcam. Whether he did it or not, and to what extent he did, we don't know. And I hopefully he feels, if he did do that, to whatever extent, he hopefully understands that this is completely unacceptable in Islam, and you can't do things like that. So again, we'll see how it pans out. But I just wanted to make this video just to clear up these misconceptions, because people are confused. It's a confusing time, and we don't know what Islam. People want to know what Islam says about these things. And if you want to say, well, Rob's practicing taqiyya and he's lying about this, I mean, you don't have to take, don't take my word for it. I mean, look up scholars and what they say about, slavery in the modern era. Another good book you can read is Slavery in Islam by Dr. Jonathan Brown. So like I said, slavery, it was back then, it was ubiquitous across all nations and cultures. Islam instituted several ways for slaves to be freed and encouraged the freeing of slaves. Again, back then there were no, having a prisoner of war and freeing them was a very dangerous thing to do, but still Islam allowed the ransoming of slaves at that time. So it just places high emphasis on freeing slaves. And again, lastly, the whole thing about having a slave as someone you can have sexual relations with. Again, that person, that woman, you have to feed them, clothe them, treat them with respect. You treat them the way you would treat your wives. If they had a kid, that kid would be a free kid. And then once the master dies, then she becomes a free woman, and the master has to take care of that kid, has to feed them, has to clothe them, and provide for them. And again, those occurred in the pre-modern times. Since slavery doesn't exist anymore, there's no need for Muslims to try to bring that back. There's no way you can possibly justify bringing it back in any non-Muslim country. Okay, so that's my time for the day. I think I've covered pretty much everything. Yeah, I mean, again, like one last thing to add, there are some people who would try to justify it. I mean, like these really, really fringe extreme groups like your Al Qaeda and your ISIS. But we disavow any type of association with those extreme groups. I mean, there's no way you can justify, having, taking sex slaves and stuff. Like I know, you had Daesh, had some Yazidis, and they turned them into sex slaves and still, but like for one, you can't do that definitely can't do that in a Muslim country, but you can't do that in a non-Muslim country either. You're under contract. You have to abide by the laws. Muslims have to abide by the laws of the land in that country. As long as they can practice their religion, they can stay there. If they can't practice their religion, then they should move to a place where they can practice their religion. But to say, oh, I want to take sex slaves because it says it in the Quran. No, you can't do this. You're not allowed to just bag, like a woman out of nowhere and just make her your sex slave. Completely unacceptable in Islam. Anyone who believes that, we disavow any association with them. And yeah. So yeah, thank you so much for your time today. This is Rob from Islam for Europeans. Please like and subscribe. I do apologize about not getting back to beef, bacon, and eggs and weekly Islamic reminders. So I want to start doing that again. But yeah, so that was my time for the day. And may Allah accept, whatever good I stated, and anything I said that was incorrect is from the devil. Okay. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.